great pleasure to be here this morning, and thank you, Jonathan, for your invitation and for twisting my arm painfully enough to get me out of bed as early as I did this morning. It is good to be here. You'll notice from your pack there's a short handout to keep us on track for the next 30 minutes or so. I've taken the liberty of changing the title very slightly. It's called Engaging the Secular University rather than Engaging the Secular Mind. And I want to start, if I may, with a small anecdote. Several years ago, I was sitting on a university committee charged with revising the examination regulations. And a question came up whether we should include a precept to ensure that observant Jewish students should not be required to sit examinations on a Saturday, and that Muslim students should have sufficient time for Friday prayers. And one of my colleagues rather indignantly spluttered, "I thought we were supposed to be a secular university." To which the response from most of the rest of us was, of course, that it was precisely because we were a secular university that we should not put unnecessary obstacles in the way of students from a religious background, any religious background. Now that exchange reminds us, doesn't it, of the malleability of the term secular. All institutions of higher education in this country are secular in some sense of the word. But in what sense? And what are we as Christian scholars to make of those various senses? How can and should we engage the secular university agenda for the next 30 minutes or so? And I've got a particular reason for wanting to tackle this topic. My colleague was working from a conception of the secular which was, frankly, rather hostile to religions and religious believers. And the rest of us were working from a conception of the secular which was more open and inclusive. And that suggests that perhaps one of the contributions we can make as Christian scholars is to ensure that our universities and colleges are secular in the right sort of way. Now, we Christians are sometimes very keen to point out that secularism is not neutral. There is no neutral standpoint on knowledge. All forms of human knowing are perspectival and presuppose theological and sometimes anti-theological frameworks. And that's all well and good, but the danger is then that we miss spotting the different types of secular and the different types of secularization that go on in our universities, and we fail to point out the dangers that might be associated with some or the benefits associated with others. So let's think first of all what we mean by a secular university, and in particular how the modern world of higher education displays patterns of secularization. And then we can think about how we as Christians can contribute in that environment. Now, in one sense, and this is only slightly tongue-in-cheek, the emergence of the University of Paris in the 12th century was a moment of secularization. An important development, because what happened was that an incorporated guild of masters and their students came out of monastic contexts of learning and worship to form an independent institution, separate from the monasteries. And there we have one of the key meanings of secularization, one of the most important meanings of social differentiation, institutional differentiation, and the emergence of the university as something other than the monastery is an important part of that grand story. Now, this is not what most people mean when they talk about the secularization of higher education. What most people mean is something that went on in the 19th century. David Bebbington, the church historian, argues that the period 1850 to 1920 was decisive for Anglo-American institutions in this respect. If you look back to 1850, Oxford and Cambridge, which of course vastly overshadowed much smaller and more recent institutions in Durham, London, and elsewhere, Oxford and Cambridge were overwhelmingly ecclesiastical. The fellows of the colleges were almost all ordained. 80% of the graduates were intended to become clergy in the Church of England. The students were in statu pupillari. They were subject to compulsory chapel and mandatory courses in Christian apologetics and Christian ethics. The ethos of the institution has been described as one of clerical classicism. Clerical classicism. classics, the liberal arts, in a clearly Christian ecclesial context. By 1920, several things had happened, 2 generations later. First, the aspiring middle classes had succeeded in their demands for curricula that were suited for professions other than the church. They were looking for education and training that would fit their young people up for all sorts of other careers. And this pressure emphasized the natural sciences, engineering and technology, and downplayed the liberal arts. Secondly, an alternative model of higher education had gained ascendancy. The founding of the University of Berlin in 1810 stands as the great example of this alternative model, Enlightenment model of higher education. Here the image was of a community of scholars in which expert professors would pursue knowledge in distinct fields of study. And these distinct fields of study had their own methodologies, and in turn these professors would then work alongside their students and train up a new generation of specialist experts to pursue knowledge in these distinct fields of study. Now what this meant was that academia was becoming professionalized. Back in 1850, only a small minority of those ordained college fellows expected to spend their entire career in the university. Only a small percentage, I think it was 13%. By 1920, the career academic was normal. So as these programs of study for non-clerical professions, academic specialization and professionalization took off, so the connections with the church, the organized church, became anachronistic. But why should willingness or ability to sign up to the 39 Articles of the Church of England have anything to do with your capacity to pursue Egyptian archaeology or cell reproduction or the behavior of markets? In any case, around the same period, particularly from 1860 to 1870, the nonconformist campaign to make religion voluntary in education, right from the word go, right the way from the bottom to the top. The campaign by nonconformist Christians to make religion voluntary in state education and organized education had also borne fruit, so that compulsory chapel or religious instruction seemed entirely out of place. And into this story, which may be familiar to some of you, we can slot the emergence of University College London, the so-called Godless of Gower Street, the reform of Oxford and Cambridge, particularly the abolition of religious tests for students and academics in the legislation of 1871, and the creation of a whole series of chairs in new subjects, so chairs in geology, sociology, economics, and biology, and so on and so on. Now from this perspective, from David Bevington's perspective, the 20th century was much more stable. Universities, of course, were subject to broader social trends of secularization in a different meaning. Secularization as the falling away of religious belief and practice. They were not immune from that. But actually, Bevington points out there were some cross-currents. So, for example, the enormous expansion of higher education in the 20th century, phenomenal expansion, was disproportionately skewed to science, natural sciences, to technology, to engineering, to, if you like, more useful subjects, and it was skewed away from the liberal arts, but nevertheless, in real terms, brute numbers of students and staff, the numbers of people studying those subjects which were associated with clerical classicism increased. Voluntary religion flourished. And of course, Oxford and Cambridge maintained and still maintain a certain paradigmatic status. And those universities, of course, have strong ecclesiastical memories and residues and connections. So among academic staff who are disproportionately drawn from Oxford and Cambridge, there is still this expectation that a university might well have some formal Christian presence or Christian relationship. So it's unusual, but not totally odd, that I have a chapel in my Bristol Hall of Residence. But what I want to do this morning is think more about modern secularism and secularization. So how does the modern university stand in relation to those early 19th century developments? And as far as I can see, what we have is a story of fundamental continuity, but subject to processes, particularly over the last few years, which notably enhance the secular character of our universities. And I want to highlight three processes: specialization, instrumentalization, and globalization. So as far as specialization is concerned, the process of the growth and subdivision of knowledge which took hold in the 19th century has continued unabated. We could look for any number of indicators of that. If we turn, for example, the 2014 Research Excellence Framework, submissions, as those of you who are involved will know, are made in 36 different units of assessment, but those 36 units of assessment are each really remarkably broad. So if we take unit of assessment number 4, that embraces psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience. Number 35, another example, embraces music, drama, dance, and performing arts. And my point here is that individual scholars working in those fields would not even claim to have a working knowledge of what was going on in other disciplines with which they've been grouped. So when I cite 36 units of assessment, I'm not suggesting there are 36 disciplines in the modern university. Each of them can be broken down, of course, into 3 or 4 or 5, and you might then recognize your home from a disciplinary point of view. Universities offer hundreds of courses, and each of these courses will have enough core and optional units to fill decades of study. I think we're also seeing a process whereby qualification for becoming an academic is becoming more and more specialized. If you take each discipline in turn, you can track the point at which the PhD becomes the normal entry qualification for a young lecturer. In my own discipline in law, it's relatively recent. It took place about 20 years ago. The point is that it becomes more and more normal to appoint not just somebody who has a good grasp of the discipline, but somebody who has some specific expertise within the discipline. So we recruit, or we look for somebody who's an expert in human genetics, or in 19th century colonial history, or in the sociology of the family, or something like that, rather than appointing a sociologist, or a geneticist, a biologist, or a historian. So specialization seems to be inevitable. It's an inevitable concomitant of the accumulation of knowledge. I think we're seeing more noticeably than that, though, an increasing instrumentalization of higher education. This seems to be stronger more recently. Now, I think we should not be unrealistically romantic about this. People have always gone to university for ends other than the pursuit of knowledge. In fact, I'm not at all sure that from a Christian perspective, the pursuit of knowledge is an end in itself. John Henry Newman famously thought so, although actually what he meant by pursuing knowledge was slightly more than piling up propositional truth claims, but actually Catholic neo-Thomists tend to agree that the pursuit of knowledge is an end in itself. St. Paul warns us that knowledge by itself puffeth up. We'll come back to this point about what the end, the purpose, the goal of higher education is in a moment. What I mean by the recent instrumentalization of higher education is the way it is being more and more insistently constructed by government to serve the individual ends of vocational training and collective ends such as technological enhancement and economic growth. Here are some basic figures. The Higher Education Statistics Agency tells us that in 2012-2013, only 2.5% of our students across undergraduate and postgraduate were studying classics, history, philosophy, and theology combined, what we could call the liberal arts. Contrast that with 7.2% in engineering and architecture, 11.5% in law, business, and administration, 11.8% in education, and an astonishing 26.6% in subjects allied to medicine. The point here is not so much that large numbers of students are doing more or less vocationally oriented programs. Even those subjects which are liberal in a classical sense are increasingly conceived of as preparations for careers. So they have to be, to justify the enormous sums that students and parents are spending, or the amount by which they are mortgaging, we should say, their future earning capacity. So knowledge becomes a more or less randomly selected raw material on which we develop graduate skills such as analysis, synthesis, critical evaluation, oral and written communication, teamwork, numeracy, and so on and so forth. I hope you recognize the rhetoric. So for me, one symbol of this development in higher education is the founding of the so-called University of Law, a university with sites across the United Kingdom that is wholly devoted to the delivery of courses in the formation of professional lawyers. in some cases in formal collaboration with leading law firms. It has no research agenda, and the education it offers is purely vocational. On the research side, the sums of money expended by government on various research councils are a very telling indicator of the priorities. If we put together, this is arguably slightly artificial, unfair, but if we put together the allocation of recurrent research expenditure for the four big science councils, the Biotechnical and Biological Sciences Research Council, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, the Medical Research Council, and the Natural Environment Research Council, if you put that together, this year you get an allocation of £20 billion. The Economic and Social Research Council gets 153 million this year, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council 98.4 million. So 0.5% of the allocation to the sciences and technology. More significant than that, though, I think, is the new impact agenda, in which research, even research in the social sciences and humanities, is increasingly required to demonstrate a beneficial social and economic effect if it is to acquire public funding. You can imagine what my philosopher colleagues make of that. So there's this growing instrumentalization of higher education, and finally globalization, by which I mean a number of processes, the increasing mobility of academic staff and students, as well as the ability to communicate rapidly and effectively anywhere in the world in English by modern technology. That process of globalization exacerbates these tendencies, because universities compete globally for resources, for staff, for students, and for reputation. So just under a fifth of students in the United Kingdom are not British, and 1 in 8 comes from outside the European Union. I have a much closer relationship, many times closer, with a colleague in Copenhagen or Sydney or Utah who is interested in the legal regulation of religions, one of my areas, and then I have with the earth scientist whose office is a few floors below mine in the middle of Bristol. I hardly know their name. So specialization, instrumentalization, and globalization are part of the story of the modern secular university. And they're part of the story of secularization because they come together to turn the university into an intellectual version of the liberal state. And what I mean by that is a rational institutional framework for the pursuit of individual goals, or merely thin collective goals, such as economic growth or technological enhancement. They remain agnostic on more fundamental questions of overarching truth, human purpose, or personal character. Again, John Henry Newman saw it coming. He warned about the university becoming, I quote, a bazaar or pantechnicon in which wares of all kinds are heaped together for sale in stalls independent of each other. And note the overtones of the marketization of higher education going on there as well, very prescient. In more modern times, Stefan Collini has called it the global multiversity. And perhaps that's what we should be talking about, not universities, but the global multiversity. That's the context in which we as Christian scholars are called to our work. So what is that calling? How are we to respond to this? I want to think first about questions of basic orientation. What do we make of the global multiversity as a whole, and then perhaps have some thought about how we might engage with it. So what's our basic orientation to this phenomenon? What do we want to say? I think we want to say simultaneously that it is good and that it is inadequate. Now this is complex because bread is good but inadequate. Government, to pick another random example, government is good but inadequate. But the point about bread is that good bread is not inadequate as bread. It does a perfectly good job as bread. It's just we cannot live by bread alone. And good government is not inadequate as government. It's just that one can't find salvation in politics. So here's the question. Is the inadequacy of a good, secular, plural university merely external? Is it simply that there's more to life than getting a doctorate or a chair? Or is the inadequacy of a good, secular, plural university, is it internal? Does it fail to achieve its potential as a university? That's the trickier question. Can universities be more than what they currently are? And this is tricky, I think, because on the one hand, there's surely nothing wrong with specialised and vocational training, or with research for technological and economic ends. If the University of Law was still called the College of Law, as it used to be called, I don't think I would have mentioned it this morning. But what's in a name? Having said that, there is still a widely shared sense among many academics that higher education can and should be much more than this. So that's what powers someone like Stefan Collini's critique of modern developments in the great little book, What Are Universities For? And it powers, I think, initiatives such as philosopher A.C. Grayling's College of the Humanities in Bloomsbury. You might have heard about that. The ghost of John Henry Newman still hovers over debates about higher education. And for Newman, of course, the idea of a university was something much richer. It was of an institution which offered a deliberately broad and multi-perspectival education, which engaged the whole person, which developed liberal virtues of character among its members, not least virtues of the intellect. And this, thought Newman, could only take place in a community of interacting scholars at different levels in their understanding, within an institution committed to a unified and fully comprehensive view of truth. In other words, for Newman, within a Catholic Christian university. Now, there's a great book which I want to draw your attention to on the reference list there by a theologian called Mike Higton, called The Theology of Higher Education. And I'll come back to his book in a moment or two. He's pointed out, quite rightly, that for the Christian theologian, knowledge is fundamentally knowledge of the divine and triune God and of his works and of his world. So the ultimate end of all knowledge must be related to God and must issue in worship. Only this can satisfy our human thirst for understanding. And I think that's a familiar, well-accepted Christian theological point. So it's not surprising that there's plenty of Christian writing extolling the superiority of a genuinely Christian higher education. Genuinely, because I think it's quite hard to find in practice. And there are plenty of non-Christian academics who are attracted to this idea, to Newman's idea of the university. We might say that the whiff of an idealized monasticism lingers in the air around us. On the other hand, I would want to say that the 19th century developments took place for a very good reason. There is nothing to be gained by winding the clock back, except, if you think of the reverse of those processes, amateurism in place of expertise, practical irrelevance in place of practical relevance, and religious exclusivity in place of the abolition of religious tests and religious inclusivity. And I don't think we want to defend amateurism, practical irrelevance, and religious exclusivity. So it is becoming extremely hard under current conditions to see how the modern secular plural multiversity could be replaced. So rather than speculating on how we might replace it and whether we could do something completely different, I want to just take this as our baseline. This is the context we find ourselves in, and ask instead, what does it mean for us to be followers of Christ? What does it mean for us to be salt and light in this context? Now, of course, that imagery, Jesus' imagery of salt and light, has very obviously, familiarly, a negative and a positive dimension. So negatively, salt prevents decay, and light shows up flaws. Positively, salt enhances flavour, and light gives direction, warmth, and comfort. So I just want to really sort of throw into our conversation and thought today 3 ways in which we might think about preventing decay, and 3 ways in which we might think about enhancing the flavour. So let's think first of all about preventing decay. And this, I think, is our first task as Christian scholars. What does that mean? Well, I guess it means preventing the slippage from the sort of university I've described, the global multiversity, into a hostile or atheist secular university. This is a university which in practice, if not officially, presupposes the falsehood of Christianity, and for that matter other religions as well, and which promotes a competing ethos and ideology. Now this slippage is easy because there is a natural affinity between the global multiversity and secular humanism as an ideology. I don't know if you came across it, but Stephen Fry recently recorded an attractive little video for the British Humanist Association in which he tells us what the meaning of life is. Stephen Fry argues that the secret of happiness lies in finding out that life has no meaning, but instead that we give it meaning, and as individuals we choose different things to give our lives meaning. There is no bigger framework out there to be discovered. Rather, we just fix on something that we find personally fulfilling and meaningful, and you go for it. That's what makes you happy, according to Stephen Fry. It's not a large jump to presuppose that the secular university is the place in which individuals pursue what counts as truth in the subjects to which they feel attracted, or vocational training for a career that they think looks interesting, and there is nothing more to be said than that. So if you're looking for an ideological fit, there is a good ideological fit between secular humanism and the modern secular plural multiversity. Resisting that slippage, though, I think it is a false slippage, means, I think, three things. Here we go. First of all, it means keeping Christianity on the agenda as an object of study. So one of the more pernicious effects of secularization theory was its assumption that religion was no longer an interesting object of study. Just as alchemy, astrology, and phrenology turned out to be false steps in the forward march of human intellect, so too religion and religious studies would wither away. Now, even before 9/11 happened, I think lots had abandoned that thesis as palpably false, and religion is very much back on the agenda in many disciplines. One of my colleagues on the Law Ref panel was recently teasing me that law and religion is all the rage now. She said, "You're obviously in the right field," and she said, "and it's not Islam, it's Christianity." Interesting comment from her. Now, of course, not every discipline can do this. Broadly speaking, we're talking about the humanities and social sciences. But as Christians working in those fields, I think we have a duty to use our discipline-specific expertise both to inform a better understanding of our own faith, if you like, speaking into our Christian constituencies, and to secure better levels of religious literacy among our contemporaries. I give just one example of this. It's a book that should have been on the reference list, the reading list, but I forgot to put it on, but it's a great book called Christianity and the University Experience, Understanding Student Faith. It's the first scholarly sociological study of Christian student experience. It was published last year by 4 authors, Matthew Guest, Kristin Owen, Sonia Sharma, Rob Warner. I do not know where these authors are coming from in terms of their faith perspective, but this is exactly the sort of work within the discipline of sociology that is of enormous service both to the church and to the secular world. And I do commend that team. It's very interesting. If you want the one-line answer, is a university a secularizing experience for our students? The one-line answer is, it all depends on which type of university and which type of student. You have to get the book. Anyway, the work of God in building the kingdom of Christ is always on the agenda for us. So that's the first point. Keep Christianity as an object of our study. Secondly, we should resist slippage by keeping the academy open to Christianity as a framework of study. This is George Marsden's point. Some of you may be familiar with George Marsden's writing on secularization in the university. If we Christians are not going to go off and form Christian academies, Christian institutes of higher education, then our main contribution should be to keep Christianity as one of the options for a framework, a foundation of our studies. We should take the professed pluralism and openness of the modern university very seriously. I think Abraham Kuyper's thoughts on Calvinism and science are still helpful here, because Kuyper insisted both on the independence of the disciplines, the freedom of science, Wissenschaft, from ecclesiastical and state control, but also the need to locate each discipline within an ideological framework, hence his promotion of the Christian Reformed Constitution of the Free University of Amsterdam. So we have a duty to spot the grand narratives at work and line up the Christian narrative alongside them. There's actually quite a tricky balance here, I think, as we straddle the modern, postmodern dilemma we need to hold both to the, in some sense, the Enlightenment optimism of modernism. Within each discipline, there is a rational, methodological common ground which delivers true knowledge, not complete knowledge, but true knowledge independently of religion. If that were not so, how could we fairly judge each other's work? There is a creation mandate there, fits theologically. But the postmodern side of the dilemma is that all truth claims are perspectival and worldview inflected, so we need to be alert and honest about the broader intellectual assumptions which frame our scholarship as well. We have to hold both of those things together. So Christianity is an object of study, Christianity is a framework of our study, and finally, we need to stand against some of those sometimes trivial but rather frustrating sillinesses which can accompany atheist secularism. So what do I mean? The university which prevents Christian students from meeting on premises, university premises, because it's committed to equality or concerned about extremism or something like that, or the university which doesn't allow its ordained academic staff to appear as Reverend Professor on its website in case it gives the impression that the clerical title is one which is recognised by the university. Political correctness that assumes there's no space for divergent opinions on matters of sexual ethics and human flourishing. Those sorts of things which I think we have a duty to try to combat. And if you think about it, what those three things mean is that we stand for academic freedom. Freedom to choose the objects of our study, freedom to adopt the most illuminating ideological framework for our study, and freedom to be the people of faith that we actually are in our universities. So that's one side, looking at a number of ways in which we can prevent decay or slippage into the atheist secular university. Let's look at the other side, enhancing the flavour. And here I simply want to pick up on Mike Higton's excellent book that I referred to a moment ago, and draw your attention to the three main suggestions that he makes of the way in which we as Christians can, as it were, identify stuff that goes on which is good and try to turn up the volume, enhance it, strengthen it. Mike refers to three aspects. He says we want to emphasize the virtuous university, the sociable university, and the good university. So first of all, virtue. To be a successful scholar, we need to develop certain sorts of virtue. Disciplines, he suggests, are moral economies. Moral economies, that is, communities of training in virtuous perception. Science depends on our becoming a certain sort of person. Discipline, persistent, impartial, honest, courteous. Higher education is an apprenticeship into these virtues. In particular, Higton emphasizes openness to judgment, by which he means both the willingness to judge and the willingness to be judged. He points out two types of bad student. One type of bad student is one who refuses to offer any opinion at all, or simply offers an unsupported opinion without making reasoned judgment. Another type of bad student refuses to submit to judgment, and so bridles up when even constructive criticism is offered of their work by somebody who is academically more advanced, a teacher. But these two virtues of openness to judge and openness to being judged are fundamentally Christ-like, because they reflect the humility and exaltation of Christ, seen most supremely in his death and resurrection. So the question this gives rise to is how in my teaching and research can I foreground, emphasize and develop the virtues that characterize good scholarship? Secondly, sociability. Now, the extent to which research and teaching are collaborative enterprises varies, again, from subject to subject. But in all, there are elements of sociability which modern university life conspires to squeeze out. So departmental coffee breaks, in my experience, have tended to die because we are too busy reading our email. Resource constraints make meeting for conferences harder. I think as Christian scholars we have a commitment and a calling to preserve and develop communities wherever possible, because community, relationality, is an indispensable element of human flourishing. So Higton suggests we should be very attentive to what he calls the conversational ecology. I like that phrase, the conversational ecology of our institutions. The theological reference point here is the recognition of individual inadequacy within the body of Christ. So what can we do to strengthen bonds of sociability? And thirdly, we should think about the common good. Higton, I think rightly, rejects the notion that education is an end in itself. Education is not an end in itself, its fundamental purpose is worship. The problem with the current governmental agenda around impact and its preference for economic or technological growth is not that it seeks an extrinsic goal for higher education, but that its vision of that goal, that end, is too narrow. Education is indeed for the common good, but what is that good? Theologically, the reference point is the ultimate fulfillment of all things under Christ in the new creation. The challenge for us is to find ways of keeping a public conversation going about what the goods of higher education are. So we want to say in response to this rather narrow economic or technological agenda, not no, but yes, and still some more. Well, it's time for me to wrap up. By way of coda, I just want to share with you a serendipitous, providential moment from my own fairly recent past. In 2009, I was asked to preach at the annual alumni weekend service in the chapel at Will's Hall of Residence in Bristol. Now, unknown to my inviter, I was in the process of being made the next warden of Will's Hall, something that I couldn't disclose at the time, but it all came together quite nicely. And even more so, I just happened, without any planning, to be reading Keith Ward's book on religion and community. And I found that what Keith Ward was saying about church and community was enormously helpful in helping me think about how I should approach my role as a live-in academic, a warden living in the middle of a group of students, as well as a scholar within the university. Now, Keith Ward suggests we should think about church as a community in 4 dimensions. A teaching community, a charismatic community, a sacramental community, and a moral community. And let me just translate those terms a little bit into a higher education context. Because I think that our students and colleagues do hanker after a slightly more ecclesial conception of university life. And to the extent that they hanker after that, this understanding of the ways in which the church forms community is, I would suggest, helpful. A teaching community. How can I find ways of ensuring that my students feel that they are collaborators in a common search for truth, rather than purchasers of a marketable commodity? And that's the pressure. How can I include them in a common enterprise of learning? Charisma, gifting. How does my university enable and celebrate the diversity of talents and gifts, perhaps in extracurricular activities, as well as in the formal curriculum, rather than merely focusing on examination success? Sacrament. What forms of embodiment should I be making an effort to preserve? Because sacrament is about the embodiment of our faith. Why is meeting a colleague for a coffee better than sending an email? It is. It needs preserving. Why did I stop providing drinks for my personal tutees, my students, getting them round to my house for a meal even? Graduation ceremonies. I think they are loosely, indirectly, sacramental. Moral communities. What virtues should I be displaying and promoting? How can I articulate them for my students and draw them out to show them that becoming well-educated is about becoming a certain sort of person? Now, of course, the university is not the church, but it can nonetheless awaken those human desires for truth, community, and service which are fulfilled in the body of Christ. And if we as Christian scholars can make those connections, we can hope, I think, that even in the context of the secular plural university, here too we see Paul's pedagogus, his schoolmaster at work, leading us, pointing us to Jesus Christ. Well, that's all I wanted to say by way of provocation and thought. I hope we have got a few minutes for some questions. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Julian. If you can just stand up and speak your question loudly and clearly, and ask you just to repeat it for the recording. Thank you.
Oh, hello. I'm Nigel Patterson. I'm the author of one of the references here that Julian's given. So, subject I've thought about a lot. And one thing that I've thought of more recently about Julian, which I'm now asking you about, is that it seems to me that there is a secular agenda going on. Now, I don't know exactly what that agenda is, but that so far we've talked, I certainly wrote my paper, as though it's a more passive thing going on. And it seems to me to be more focused than I did before. What is your thought on that? To what extent do you feel there is a secular agenda being pursued in universities?
So the question is, to what extent is a secular agenda being pursued deliberately, actively within universities? Lots to say. I mean, lots to say certainly in terms of what we mean by secular in that context. I don't see a secular agenda being pursued as a matter of formal policy or institutional structure or anything like that. I think there is probably a greater openness to cultural diversity that's being forced on universities by, for example, equalities legislation. So the equalities legislation, of course, can cut against sort of some residual Christian ethos to the extent that it's there, but it can also cut against an atheist ethos to the extent that it excludes students from religious minorities. We take, for example, my opening example of accommodating students in examination timetables. I think a university that failed to accommodate a Jewish or Muslim student and set an assessment system which made it impossible to worship according to their faith would probably be getting a rap over the knuckles from their equality and diversity officer and would be a bit worried about legal action. So I mean, there's a sense in which there is what do we mean by secularism here is a problematic one. I think the culture is more hostile to Christianity. So Christianity is moving from being sort of not everyone's cup of tea, but in some sense mainstream and legitimate and certainly more conservative, orthodox conceptions of Christianity, becoming slightly more peripheral. And we see that in the university because we're not immune to those changes. But I would see that as a cultural shift which infects the university rather than a specific sort of institutional shift in terms of structure, management or policy. But there may well be counterexamples that you and others can give. Thank you for the question.
An interesting situation in America, having the experiment, if you like, of the Christian university. That experiment has been run for decades. Do you have any comments on desirability, the usefulness of creating slightly more monastic foundation, more exclusive Christian ethos, or actually is that just running away from the world Christian religion?
So the question is, in a sense, the big question, isn't it, in this area? If we had the opportunity, or should we think seriously about Christian institutions of higher education, in particular, what can we learn from the experience in the United States, which is the most directly relevant? I guess we're probably going to differ on this one as Christians engaging in this field. Personally, I'm glad that I work within a secular, plural context. I'm glad because I think it allows me to engage more easily with a wider range of people. I don't come necessarily with a badge on. Now, people will know me, and as they get to know me, they can work out where I'm coming from. But there is a sense in which you are forced to engage with those who are different from you, those who are disagreeing with you, and so long as you're not prevented from doing the research you want to do, and so long as you're not prevented from being the person you are, I think that slightly more challenging environment of the modern, secular, plural university is a good discipline. It's a hard discipline, but it's a good one. Now that's where I'm at, and I can see there might well be contexts in which perhaps from a student point of view, there might be a value in having the ability to be more explicit about Christian formation. I guess, I mean, looking back at my own student career, I was very lucky attending Cambridge University, where Christianity is very present in lots of different forms and lots of different theological variants, which gives you that sort of spiritual formation, which is helpful. One of the interesting bits of data that comes out of this study is that it's the more traditional type of university, like Oxford and Cambridge, which has the greatest impact on students' religious change, both in terms of students departing from the faith about 12%, and students strengthening their faith, about 25% of Christian students. So there's an interesting sense in which the stronger Christian presence, as it were, has almost a divisive effect on students. It forces them both one way and the other way, which is why we can't answer the secularization question about universities and student life in a very straightforward way. Thank you.
One more question.
If I can just sort of give the context, so it's not my area. So one of the medieval visions of theology was the Queen of Sciences, and that was a first order study of God. And obviously that's something different to keeping Christianity as an object of study. Because astrology is perfectly legitimate object of study in sociology and science. But that's very different from doing astrology. Whereas one of my reflections on sort of British institutional context is there seems increasingly little space for people to be doing genuine theology as the first order study. And there's the secularization pressures developed by the university, and then concurrently the Church of England, as the key institutional banker, has been rowing back financially on support in higher education. So the tutors at the seminary courts are basically massively overworked. And without at all wanting to be rude, they're often not the front rank academics that you might find in the university context. So it seems to me there's a real gap for first order Christian minds, theologians, to do the kind of front rank theology which we've had historically inherited. Have you got any thoughts on where that institutional space might exist and what the structures are?
So the question here then is, there's a Livi Observation, which I have noticed myself, I agree with you, is that theology is I would say a normative discipline rather than a descriptive religious studies discipline is squeezed out increasingly, and then the question is, where do we do it? We need to do it, where do we do it, and where do we do it well? I'd rather you asked a theologian on this. I mean, I'm going to be cautious. I know my colleague Gavin DaCosta has written at length on this problem, and he's been a great defender of the place of, as professor of systematic Catholic theology at Bristol, a great defender of the place of systematic theology within the secular plural academy. So, and you know, George Marsden will say the same. He'll say, look, let's just take pluralism seriously. We have no problem with Marxists being Marxists in the academy. We have no problem with feminists being feminists in the academy. We have no problem even with Muslim scholars being committed to Islamic law, as long as it's of a certain, within bounds, reading of the Islamic tradition. We don't have problems with those, so why do we have a problem? And I guess that's my question back to religious studies departments, is what is it about the ethos in your department, which I don't know, don't experience, which has made it hard for people to sustain normative systematic theological study alongside other forms of engagement with religion. And I guess if I'd read more of Gavin's work, I might be able to have a slightly better informed answer, but perhaps we could have a conversation about that over lunch as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.